Simons.
Thank you very much indeed, Cahill, and I'd like to thank all senators who contributed to this section. And I think that the debate is extremely constructive. And I share, and I've been through this for a long time now, their concern about the residents. Forgive me if I said this at second stage, but I've debated this so often I'm not quite sure where I've repeated myself and where I haven't. But I have met residents, I think, from every group that have sought to meet me. Maybe not St Margaret's, but I'm not sure. But I certainly met with a group from Senator Clifford Lee, from Claire Daly, who asked me to meet a group of travellers at the airport, from Senator O'Brien, Deputy O'Brien, and many others, opposition, government. I don't mind, and I've agreed to meet them, and will continue to meet them if they feel that that is useful. And that was long before the regulator was the noise regulator was finally chosen. And this is a problem, and it is constantly a problem. And don't let's compete for sympathy with people who are confronted by this problem, because everybody feels that. The problem has to be resolved, and it's never going to be resolved in a way which is utterly satisfactory to everybody. That would be impossible. But let me first of all say I applaud the fact that Senator Crockall went out there. That's not some sort of phony bombast that is produced in this House from time to time and the other House about things like this. He went out and he found out what he found out. He had empathy with the residents, and indeed came in and pleaded their case in this House. He says it may not be effective tonight, or it may. I can't prejudge that. But there is, when you have noise of this sort, a real case to be made for the residents who find themselves victims of noise which they find intolerable. I have to, as Minister, balance, as everybody in this House does, I have to balance that with the need to keep the airport open. And it would be utterly crazy if I, as Minister, were to say, well, that the interests of a very small minority merits an airport being closed or being unable to operate. My duty then is to the residents to alleviate the problem as much as possible, to ensure that it's not excessive, and to compensate them as well when they're in a situation which is very difficult for them to deal with. That is what we've tried to do in this bill. I know that there are justifiable criticisms on behalf of the residents, and I thought the contributions from Sinn Féin were very authentic and very sincere, as was from Senator Humphreys. But they have to understand, and I think they do understand, that this is a matter of common sense, that we actually have to keep the airport open. And what Senator Riley said was absolutely true. He's a doctor. He understands health better than anybody in this House, I suggest. But that the World Health, the actual volume, the actual decibels in this particular case are not acceptable. That this would, in fact, have an effect on the airport, which would detrimentally affect the economy of the country, the neighbourhood, and indeed the DAA, which is, for all its faults, employs one of your children, Senator Humphreys, for all its faults, is operating a very successful airport, which we must keep open, and we are determined that should do so. And it's the key to economic prosperity. It's a key to a lot of tourists coming to this country, and it is something which has got to be given consideration as well, and mustn't be treated in any Rahuluk way. I don't suggest that any senators are doing that, and I respect fully what all senators have said here this evening, but they have to also respect the fact that the minister can't be expected to take measures which would have such an effect on the economy that it could be utterly disastrous. And we've got to listen to voices of moderation on this, and that's why we have appointed a regulator. And those who criticise the regulator will have to realise that some of his terms of reference, and it's mentioned quite frequently in the actual regulation, the 598 of 2014, the importance, it's quite often, and I'll just quote one of the importance of health aspects need to be recognised in relation to noise problems. It's therefore important that those aspects be taken into consideration in a consistent manner at all airports when a decision is taken on noise abatement objectives, taking into account the existence of common union rules in this area. Therefore, health aspects should be assessed in accordance with union legislation on the evaluation of noise effects. Health is not being ignored at all, and it is a very important part of the equation. And we could debate forever what the acceptable decibel rate is, but we will leave that to the regulator, not to ourselves or anybody else. But I acknowledge the concerns. I would like to make it absolutely clear that the assessment of the health impact of aircraft noise is an integral part of this bill. This bill and the EU regulation underpinning it requires the noise regulator to take full account of existing EU law in relation to health. It's important that this House understands that the issue of measuring and monitoring the health impact of aircraft noise has been discussed at length at each stage of this bill so far, and rightly so. It is a hugely important issue, and local residents are entitled to understand what it is in this bill to protect their interests, including in relation to the control of noise and its impact on their health. Let me quote directly from Regulation 598, which underpins this bill and applies fully in Ireland. Article 12A of the regulation states that the purpose to the regulatory framework that Fingal will roll out is to facilitate the achievement of specific noise abatement objectives, including health aspects, at the level of individual airports. The regulation also states the importance of health aspects needs to be recognised in relation to noise problems, and it is therefore important that those aspects be taken into consideration in a consistent manner at all airports when a decision is taken on noise abatement objectives, taking into account the existence of common union rules in this area. Therefore, health aspects should be assessed in accordance with union legislation on the evaluation of noise effects. It's there in the directive. Health is important. Health must be taken into account. The bill also makes specific cross-reference to the 2002 Environmental Noise Directive and the 2018 Environmental Noise Regulations, which leaves no doubt that these EU laws apply to the work of the noise regulator too. This reference was an amendment made at report stage in the Dáil following representations from Deputies Robert Troy and Dara O'Brien. Again, let me quote directly. The Environmental Noise Directive and its updated implementing regulations from 2018 set out, and I quote, a common approach within the European Union intended to avoid, prevent or reduce on a prioritised basis the harmful effects, including annoyance, due to exposure to environmental noise. And by harmful effects, the directive means negative effects on human health. That's a quote. This is unequivocal. As regards the amendments put forward by senators to introduce changes to definitions and specific noise thresholds, I cannot accept these. These amendments will not have any practical effect on how the noise regulator will incorporate the assessment of health into its decision-making, but it would have the effect of unilaterally amending what has been agreed at the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, and included in EU regulation. I'm sure it's well intended, but it is not something that we can allow to pass into Irish law. Similar amendments have been proposed by Dáil deputies at various points through committee and report stage of this bill, which I have explained are not appropriate because they have the effect of amending an EU regulation. As we all should know, the national parliament of a member state is not able to amend an EU regulation. EU regulations are made and amended at EU level through the EU institutions of which Ireland is a part, the Commission, the Council and the EU Parliament. I'm sure this is not a deliberate attempt to cut across EU law, but that is what this amendment does. The main responsibility of the noise regulator is to adopt the balanced approach as agreed at UN level and written into EU law, which entails undertaking an analysis of the various measures available to reduce noise through their exploration of four principal elements: noise reduction at source, land use planning and management, noise abatement operational procedures and operating restrictions as a last resort. It is not for Ireland to redefine the entire balanced approach process. The focus of Regulation 598 is to apply the balanced approach when a noise problem is identified. This is set out in recitals 3, 4, 9, 14 and 18 of the regulation. It is also set out in Articles 1, 2, 5 and 6 of the regulation. It is simply not permissible in national law to redefine the meaning of the balanced approach as set out in EU regulation. With regards to the proposed amendment to introduce a specific fixed decibel limit for night time, this too runs contrary to existing EU law. First of all, on a matter of principle, it undermines the principal policy objective of the bill, which is to establish an independent noise regulator that will make evidence-based regulatory decisions based on technical assessments and public consultations. It is not appropriate that primary legislation includes a fixed threshold that in effect undermines the independence and expertise of the new regulator. That's what the regulator is for. A similar amendment was passed in the Doyle report stage, and that needs to be rectified because to allow the bill to pass with these provisions included would be legally unsound. I'm advised that inclusion of any specific threshold in the bill amounts to the introduction of an operating restriction, and as such is in direct contravention of everything EU Regulation 598 is trying to introduce. Government Amendment 19 will be moved later in the debate to remove specific reference to these guidelines, which were inserted at Doyle report stage. It is not a question of whether the WHO guidelines are right or wrong. Rather, it is about what is possible and possible to implement, and in what time frame and at what cost. These are all of the things being considered at EU level as part of the review of the 2002 Environmental Noise Directive, which include consideration of how to treat and reflect the WHO guidelines. I cannot stand over a bill that preempts decisions about future EU regulations and directives on environmental noise.